So it's good to have you here for this next unit. We'll cover things in Unit 16, just kind of by review. But after we get done today, the only 3 more sessions before we've got the second part of the Crossways materials covered up. So we'll be spending time again today with both the kingdoms of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And we'll see, we stop at the end of the destruction of the northern kingdom. And when we're here next week, we'll look at kind of the exile, and then we'll look at Josiah's reform. And then the final unit, if you've peeked ahead in this section of the Crossways, is called Worship and War. So we'll go back and sort of look at how worship has taken shape in various times during the history that we've been following, and also get a chance to dig a little more into that ugly part of the war and the violence that occurs. But anyway, let's look at page
next week. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. Right. The next time we meet. Yeah. And our calendar here, for those of you maybe watching this later, it's Ash Wednesday next week. So we will not have a session that day. But open up in your student book to page 35, and we will join in that opening prayer. Let's pray. Eternal and gracious God, inspire us to find constant comfort in this, that although earthly kingdoms come and go, your kingdom will never end. As we grapple with the dreams and desires of your Old Testament people, teach us to know and rejoice in your limitless grace and eternal wisdom. We thank you for revealing these things to us in and through your written and living word. We thank you for sending that final and true Son of David, that one who is greater than Solomon, your Son, Jesus the Messiah. We thank you for the upside down kingdom you established through his servant life, death, and resurrection. May we find joy in walking in that kingdom and seeking to draw others into it. In Jesus' loving, forgiving name. Amen. So if you turn to page 76 in the textbook, shall we say, we'll review Unit 16. And as you'll see, there's 6 bullet points, but we only had 3 pictures. So somebody want to do 16A?
After succeeding his father David, Solomon had his brother Adonijah killed, and the priest Abiathar exiled. They had posed a threat in his bid for the throne. He also had Joab, his cousin, and Shimei, the Benjamin, executed, which David had commanded him to do. Solomon did away with the borders of the former tribal league and placed 12 officials over the northern part of his realm and 1 over Judah. He also married many foreign women, perhaps with a view to cementing relations with their country's origin. Solomon undertook extensive building ventures both within and beyond Jerusalem, including a harbor city at Ezion-Geber and fortresses at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. During the early part of his reign, some were loud in their praises with regard to life under Solomon. They rejoiced that the nation had a large population and that all were able to eat, drink, and be happy.
All right. So lots of that stuff is picked up here in this picture. Kind of in the center, you've got the 3 people with drops of blood under a dagger. Those are the 3 that were killed. And then the priest was exiled to Anatolia. So it's kind of this little dotted line there. You've got the foreign wives with their foreign gods. You have these fortress cities, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And interesting, the word in Hebrew for hill is har. So these fortresses are often on high ground, which is more defensible. And so Har Megiddo in the New Testament is Harmageddon, which is Armageddon. So that's a connection there down the road. But again, lots of building projects that's shown kind of in this insert, even the shipping and things like that. And of course, the temple is the thing for which he is most known. And then this whole notion of prosperity, right? Everybody under their own vine, under their own fig tree, certainly within the early reign of Solomon, seems to be a happy, delightful time. However, 16b.
However, with the passing of time, opinions changed. Not only had Solomon married many foreign women, he had also built shrines for the worship of the false gods whose wives and concubines had brought with them. Furthermore, he made use of forced labor to carry out his building ventures. Toward the close of Solomon's reign, the Syrians and Edomites revolted against Solomon and gained their independence. Already prior to Solomon's death, a prophet predicted that the nation would eventually split into two regions.
Right. So you see this big sword here in the center, and then it's kind of cracking north and south with the orange on the top and Israel, the yellow on the bottom, Judah. So that's going to be coming. You've got the forced labor up here, right? 2 months they get to tend to their own business, but the third month they need to work for the king. And one assumes, of course, that there was some kind of overlap of schedule, right? So perhaps somewhat like quad graphics, you worked your you worked your overnight shift for a while, and then you had to go to the day shift, and then you go to the anyway. So a couple months on to do your own thing, and then working for the king. And the whips are up here because it's conscription, it's forced labor. Here again are Solomon's 7 for the 700 wives, 3 for the 300 concubines, the buying of horses and chariots in Egypt and selling them elsewhere. So these are typically not parts of the Solomon story that we get taught in Sunday school when we're kids growing up, but it is there. And I don't know about you, but I sort of wonder, like, why wouldn't he just say to the wives, sorry, you've got to worship God? But I suppose in reality, it's a reminder of a unpleasant human trait that still exists in the world today, is that if you will, in that realm of politics, of governing, you get these odd alliances and sometimes what's on paper doesn't actually get lived out in day-to-day life. But yeah, it is going to not be a united monarchy for long. Any questions on that second part? And then our last picture focuses in on the temple. Someone grab that. 16c.
The best known of Solomon's building projects was the Jerusalem temple, an ornate and lavish structure that played an important role in the history of God's people until it was destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC.
Yep, we'll be picking up on that. And depending again on the kind of Bible you have, some Bibles actually have pictures and reconstructions. We take this information and try and piece it together as best we can. But it was a pretty impressive structure for its time. Somebody will just keep that up because 16d is about the dedication, if someone could read that.
Solomon himself presided at the dedication of the temple, during the course of which he had the Ark of the Covenant placed in the structures Holy of Holies. The temple had taken 7 years to build. In the prayer of dedication, Solomon encouraged the people to pray about many needs and challenges, but always to face the temple while doing so, even when in exile in a distant land.
Yeah, and it's always interesting when you're looking at scripture to try and determine what are the, if you will, predictive things that are mentioned there, and how it also may be someone looking back, writing the account, but aware of those things. And so certainly, just like we saw with Samuel warning the Israelites that if they wanted a king, the king was going to do all these things to them. We see that actually coming into being during Solomon's reign. He's the one king who's described as doing all the things that Samuel said, you're going to regret having a king because king's going to do this stuff. So, but nevertheless, the dedication prayer is lovely in its sense, inviting God's eye to always be on the temple. And we still carry that sort of thinking in our minds today. Some people know you can pray anywhere, but sometimes you just feel better if you come to the church building and pray, right? People know you can worship anywhere, but there's something about gathering together in that space designed for worship. So some of that carries over into our time today. So somebody take 16E.
Although the Spirit of God comes upon both Saul and David, no reference is made to the Spirit of God coming upon Solomon. Solomon certainly ensured that his personal needs and those of his household were met. To pay the Phoenicians for their role in his building project, Solomon gave them part of the promised land, 20 cities in Galilee. He also engaged in the sale of weapons. He bought horses and chariots from Egypt and sold them to nations to the north of his realm. Although tradition ascribes to Solomon the writing of much wisdom literature, it is possible that in keeping with ancient Near Eastern practices, he made use of wise men in his court to produce these. Because Solomon had funded these writing projects, the end result was attributed to him.
And again, that practice still prevails. Perhaps you know people who in engineering or other sorts of ways have developed things that get patented, but the company they work for gets to register the patent, not the particular men or women who were behind that. So anything there? And last section.
Although Israel progressed materially as a result of Solomon's efforts, and its spiritual strength diminished, Solomon's negative example contributed towards the state of affairs. After his death, the citizens of the northern region made it clear to Solomon's son, the successor Rehoboam, that they had no intention of submitting to his rule as a matter of course. They wanted a satisfactory policy statement more before making any commitments. When Rehoboam told the northerners that he would rule them even harsher than his father had done, the northerners declared their independence from Judah and appointed Jeroboam, a former overseer of Solomon's forced labor projects, as their king. What had been a united kingdom now became a divided kingdom. After being made king of the northern kingdom, Jeroboam established shrines in Bethel and Dan, placed a golden calf in each, and appointed priests of his own choosing to serve at them. The purpose of these shrines was to prevent his subjects from having any further contact with Judah, Jerusalem, and its temple, and the Davidic dynasty.
Okay, and that's where we're going to pick up in our lesson today. Again, we're in First and Second Kings. We'll get mostly through those. By my count, when I sat down to prepare, I counted 50 pages in my Bible of text that we're going to be covering. So there's no way we're going to get all of it read in this session. In fact, I like to think I'm a slow reader, in case you didn't know. And so I thought 50 pages, I'm not sure if I just sat down for a couple of hours and tried to read on my own that I would get through all of that. So we're going to dig a little bit into there and begin by way of the timeline. We've been working our way through, and we're here now to really this split at 9:22, but putting that picture up, so we'll kind of be in this section of the timeline today, these couple of centuries that are spilled out, and you can see the timeline below kind of continues on, but once there's this split, you have this timeline up above. It actually begins with when Saul dies and his son takes over for a little period of time. But anyway, this is the northern kings, and these are the southern kings. And I think, yeah, we've got this picture We'll go after some of these things here in just a moment, but actually put together a little chart of with the timeline itself. So here's that section kind of blown up a little bit that we're going to be looking at, and we're going to see somewhat akin to the graphic that we'll come to, that there's these kings who are part of the United Kingdom, Saul, and then David and Solomon. And then in the southern kingdom, all these different kings, with the exception of Athaliah, who we'll get to a little bit. But these are all yellow because, with the exception of her, they're all descendants of David. So this is kind of David's family tree. Saul's family tree, I've got white. So his son Ishbosheth, or Ishbaal, as he's sometimes referred to, depending on your translation. Then we got all these different little dynasties, sometimes only one person long. But we'll get a chance to dig into these things a little more in detail. But I'll go back to this picture for now. What I'd like you to do is open up in your text to page 83. So we're going to skip ahead just a little bit. Because as you saw, and you were referencing as you were first arriving, that this is challenging reading. For several reasons. One of it is it's kind of a seesaw because it goes back between north and south and north and south. And sometimes the north king lasts longer. So you got a couple of south kings in there. It's often the other way as well. And it's just really confusing. But I think he does a pretty good job of kind of setting the stage of what you're going to read. There's this pattern that continues, this framework. And so, with the southern kings, you have some reference, while it still exists, to the northern king and who's reigning and what year of that king's reign it is, that then the southern king is named. So-and-so, Amaziah is king of Judah, or whoever, and he began to reign. And then you get information about his age, how long he reigned, his name, and sometimes the queen mother is mentioned, sort of interestingly enough. And then there's some kind of evaluation about whether that king is good, meaning compared to David, or not, because he didn't follow or walk in David's ways. And then that ending. Now, the rest of the acts of this king, aren't they written in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? And again, the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah and the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel are not First and Second Chronicles that we have in our Bibles. These are works that are lost to history. And we'll come back to the part underneath, but that pattern is persistent. Same kind of pattern is repeated down below for the kings of the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel. And now it's referencing the king who's ruling down there, what year it was, what his name, and then here comes the name of the northern king. You're given a little detail about his reign, where his capital was, because the capital's moved around. And then immediately, those kings are written off as bad because they walk in the ways of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and the sin which he made Israel sin. And we'll go into detail. And then it kind of wraps up to talk about the rest of the acts. Aren't they written this? And he slept with his fathers, and so reigned in his stead. Or, as you'll see as we work our way through a little bit, very often those dynasties changed because there's assassinations that occur and somebody else grabs for power, and they take some control. And by and large, you'll get a little bit of detail. Now, when we get to Ahab, who's the worst of the worst of the worst, we have quite a bit of information. And of course, in the midst of the narrative, we will run into Elijah and Elisha and others. But the roles of the prophets start to emerge a little more clearly, because as we read in the summary from the previous lesson, even though it talks about the Spirit of the Lord falling upon Saul, Spirit of the Lord falling upon David, doesn't talk about the Spirit of the Lord falling on Solomon, but we start to run into these prophets more and more. And again, if you go back just for a moment to the timeline, you see here is the section we're covering today. Here's Elijah, and Elisha named. And then you've got these scrolls with numbers on them. And so we have several of them showing up here in what's referred to as the 8th century BC. And then there's a whole bunch more scrolls over here. And so the works of the prophets start to emerge. And we will get to those in part 3 that we have in a few lessons down the road. And there's a distinction made between what are called the literary prophets and the non-literary prophets. Literary here, not referring to their ability to read and write, but rather to the sense of, is there a book with that prophet's name attached to it? Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc. They're referred to as literary prophets because we have books with their names, or better said, scrolls with their names. But you have non-literary prophets like Elijah and Elisha and Micaiah and others that we're going to meet along the way here. So that just sets the framework. Does that make sense? Or at least a little bit of sense. So we're going to get out of this part now and just spend some time in the text. And if I calculated correctly, we're going to have an opportunity to spend quite a bit of time in this back part of First Kings, and then we'll have to scratch our way through much of Second Kings, but at least gives you a framework to see some of these patterns emerging. So in First Kings chapter 12, starting at verse 25, this is right where the kingdom is torn apart. And the in earlier in the chapter, when Rehoboam said that, you thought you had it hard under my dad, I'm going to show you what hard is. It says in verse 16, when all Israel saw that the king would not listen to them, the people answered the king, what share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel, look now to your own house, O David. Those words are similar to what happened after David came back from having to run away from Absalom. And the tribe of Benjamin in particular said, we're out of here, kind of thing. But so the kingdom splits, and I'll start reading in verse 25. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and resided there. He went out from there and built Penuel. So notice the capital's moved. Started in Shechem, now moves to Penuel. Then Jeroboam said to himself, now the kingdom may well revert to the house of David. If this people continues to go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, the heart of this people will turn again to their master, King Rehoboam of Judah. Then they will kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah, right? What's he saying? He says, if people continue to go down to Jerusalem to worship, which is now in that kingdom and not in our kingdom, there's going to be the potential for desertion. And so what does he do? It says he took counsel, he made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, you've gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. He set one in Bethel, the other he put in Dan. So Bethel's in the southern part of the northern kingdom, and Dan is in the northern part of the northern kingdom. And this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship there, the one at Bethel and the other as far as Dan. He also made houses on high places and appointed priests from among all the people who were not Levites. Jeroboam appointed a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival that was in Judah. And he offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he had made. He went up to the altar that he had made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month that he alone had devised, and he appointed a festival for the people of Israel, and he went up to the altar to offer incense. So clearly condemned by the writer. This is bad news. And the language is even reported, right? Here are your gods, O Israel, which is the same thing the people said way back when Aaron made the golden calf. And so it is certainly possible that they're worshiping idols. But some suggest, and it's an interesting suggestion to kind of watch and follow, that what he did was made copies of those cherubim that were in Solomon's temple and set one up in Bethel and the other up in Dan. So there's still two cherubim, but they're not in one little confined space, and that the people are actually worshiping God in those locations. So just watch as we work our way through the text. But very clearly in the next chapter that you're going to read with me, we're going to end up hearing some of the negative stuff here, right? So let's hear about some unnamed prophets. Somebody read chapter 13, verses 1 through 10 to start us off.
At the Lord's command, a man of God from Judah went to Bethel, arriving there just as Jeroboam was approaching the altar to burn incense. Then at the Lord's command, he shouted, "O altar, altar, this is what the Lord says. A child named Josiah will be born into the dynasty of David. On you he will sacrifice the priests from the pagan shrines who come here to burn incense. The human bones will be burned on you." That same day, the man of God gave a sign to prove his message. He said, "The Lord has promised to give this sign. This altar will split apart and its ashes will be poured out on the ground." When King Jeroboam heard the man of God speaking against the altar at Bethel, he pointed at him and shouted, "Seize that man." But instantly the king's hand became paralyzed in that position and he couldn't pull it back. At the same time, a wide crack appeared in the altar and the ashes poured out, just as the man of God had predicted in his message from the Lord. The king cried out to the man of God, "Please ask the Lord your God to restore my hand again." So the man of God prayed to the Lord, and the king's hand was restored, and he could move it again. Then the king said to the man of God, "Come to the palace with me. I have something to eat, and I will give you a gift." But the man of God said to the king, "Even if you gave me half of everything you own, I would not go with you. I would not eat or drink anything in this place, for the Lord gave me this command: you must not eat or drink anything while you are there, and do not return to Judah by the same way you came." So he left Bethel and went home another way.
Okay, so here we go. It's clearly the condemnation of this shrine at Bethel. And then if you got a chance to read what comes next is, turns out there's another prophet. He's old, but he lives in Bethel. One of his sons comes and reports to him what happened. And then he goes chasing after the guy and tells him this fabricated story, right? That God said, "Oh, I know God told you not to eat, but God sent me to come get you, to bring you to my house so you can eat." And then he's okay, so he comes and he does that. And as that happens, all of a sudden the Spirit of the Lord falls upon that old prophet and he prophesies against this guy that he's indeed going to die. And it's like, this is a weird story, right? It's kind of messed up because you got a prophet of the Lord lying to another prophet of the Lord, and there's various ways people might interpret. The way I like to do it is simply this: it's trying to show us how messed up it is, religiously messed up in that northern kingdom. And so perhaps this account is just there, but again, it's this very strange kind of thing. And of course, this guy, when he dies, wants to be buried with this guy. And later on, if you got that far reading, we'll get he'll show up in when Joash is doing his reform. So and so it kind of concludes then in verse 33, even after this event, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way, but made priests for the high places, again, from among all the people. Any who wanted to be priests, he consecrated for the high places. This matter became a sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off and to destroy it from the face of the earth. I think your translation Liz and others of you might have high places immediately rendered as pagan altars or something like that.
Priest for pagan shrines.
Pagan shrines. It. We'll get there. Again, the way these texts are interpreted across the spectrum of church bodies and theological perspectives, they get looked at a little bit differently. So there are, it's going to appear to be high places that are, they're all not Jerusalem. So as far as the writer of the Kings is concerned, they're bad. Because remember, even Solomon worshiped at the high place, but after he got wisdom, he came and worshiped in front of the ark in Jerusalem, right? So this centralization kind of sense. But in any event, that's what comes up. So now it gets kind of an unpretty ending, right? Somebody take chapter 14 and read through verse 18.
At that time, Abijah, son of Jeroboam, fell sick. Jeroboam said to his wife, "Go disguise yourself so that it will not be known that you are the wife of Jeroboam, and go to Shiloh for the prophet Ahijah, sorry, is there, who said of me that I should be king over this people. Take with you 10 loaves, some cakes, and a jar of honey, and go to him. He will tell you what shall happen to the child." Jeroboam's wife did so. She set out and went to Shiloh and came to the house of Ahijah. Now Ahijah could not see, for his eyes were dim because of his age. But the Lord said to Ahijah, "The wife of Jeroboam is coming to inquire of you concerning your son, for he is sick. Thus and thus you shall say to her." When she came, she pretended to be another woman, but then Ahijah heard the sound of her feet as she came in at the door. He said, "Come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why do you pretend to be another? For I am charged with heavy tidings for you. Go tell Jeroboam, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, because I exalted you from among the people, made you leader over my people Israel, and tore the kingdom away from the house of David to give it to you. Yet you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commandments and followed me with all his heart, doing only that which was right in my sight. But you have done evil above all those who were before you, and have gone and made for yourself other gods and cast images, provoking me to anger. And have thrust me behind your back. Therefore, I will bring evil upon the house of Jeroboam. I will cut off from Jeroboam every male, both bond and free in Israel, and will consume the house of Jeroboam just as one burns up dung until it is all gone. Anyone belonging to Jeroboam who dies in the city, the dogs shall eat, and anyone who dies in the open country, the birds of the air shall eat, for the Lord has spoken. Therefore, set out, go to your house. When your feet enter the city, the child shall die. All Israel shall mourn for him and bury him, for he alone in Jeroboam's family shall come to the grave, because in him there is found something pleasing to the Lord, the God of Israel, in the house of Jeroboam. Moreover, the Lord will raise up for himself a king over Israel, who shall cut off the house of Jeroboam today, even right now. The Lord will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. He will root up Israel out of this good land that he gave to their ancestors and scatter them beyond the Euphrates, because they have made their sacred poles, provoking the Lord to anger. He will give Israel up because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned and which he caused Israel to commit. Then Jeroboam's wife got up and went away, and she came to Tirzah. As she came to the threshold of the house, the child died. All Israel buried him and mourned for him, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant the prophet Ahijah.
All right, so a few little pieces here, one of which being, if you find favor in the eyes of the Lord, you'll die a death of natural causes. You're still going to die, but if I mean, there's that in there. But notice how when he sends his wife down to the prophet, that she brings goodies, right? So herein is the practice that's still sometimes done in parishes where people want to come into the pastor and ask, bring some goodies along. So cheesy potatoes or other things like that are always appreciated. No, I mean, but you just see some of these practices persist, right? And Jeroboam then wanted to find out what's going to happen to his son. It's not good news, right? He's gonna die. And it's interesting, in verses 8, it mentions that didn't follow in the way, not like my servant David, who kept my commandment and followed me with all his heart. And we're gonna say, wait a minute, you know what? And we'll actually get, you may remember in a little bit later, we'll come across a passage which says David did everything right, except for the matter of the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So it sort of catches that part. But what did David do? One God in Jerusalem. That's going to be emphasized over and over and over here. But so now already Jeroboam's reign is and dynasty is going to end up pretty short. But notice the ending here. Let's see. 19 and 21 says, now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he warred and how he reigned, are written in the books of the annals of the kings of Israel. The time that Jeroboam reigned was 22 years. So out of 22 years of reign, about the only thing you hear about Jeroboam from this writer is about setting up those rival worship places, right? And not only do they have these main shrines at Bethel in the north or in the south and Dan in the north, but you hear about these other high places that were put in place. And now his son Nadab rules. But meanwhile, we got to go back. This is kind of like this flip-flop, right? We got to go back and catch back up with Rehoboam. So somebody go ahead and read starting at verse 21 through the end of the chapter.
Now Rehoboam, son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city that the Lord had chosen out of the tribes of Israel to put his name there. His mother's name was Naamah, the Ammonite. Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They provoked him to jealousy with their sins that they committed, more than all that their ancestors had done. For they also built for themselves high places, pillars, and sacred poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There were also male temple prostitutes in the land. They committed all the abominations of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, King Shishak of Egypt came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took everything. He also took away all the shields of gold that Solomon had made. So King Rehoboam made shields of bronze instead and committed them to the hands of the officers of the guard, who kept the door of the king's house. As often as the king went into the house of the Lord, the guard carried them and brought them back to the guard room. Now the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? There was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. Rehoboam slept with his ancestors and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. His mother's name was Naamah, the Ammonite. His son Abijam succeeded him.
Okay. So back in verse 21, it says he's 17 years old when he began to reign. Let's see. Oh, no, he reigned. Say he was 41. He reigned 17 years. How many years did Jeroboam reign? 22. So before Jeroboam is out of the picture, Rehoboam is going to die. So now we're going to have to flip and catch up with his son. So again, that's the jockeying back and forth, or if you will, it's kind of like a split screen TV where you're watching two different things sort of unfold at the same time. Again, we're not given very much information. Interestingly here, we're told the people did what was evil, right? Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And you have all of these other worship places, some of them clearly idolatrous, others perhaps not, and we'll catch this a little bit later. But on every high hill, under every green tree, these are the places where these worship sites would be. We'll get to the Psalms much later, but many people are familiar with Psalm 121, which says, I lift up my eyes to the hills, from where will my help come? when you understand that the hills are the places where these rival altars and often pagan altars are, it makes sense when he says, where my help come? My help comes from the Lord. And so it's always fascinating to kind of watch that unfold. But so we're not told a heck of a lot, but in good Deuteronomic fashion, the people of Judah do these things that are wrong, and so this punishment is going to fall upon them. In this case, what's the punishment? Pharaoh comes up, and 5 years after Solomon's death, right? Because this is after 5 years for Rehoboam. 5 years after Solomon's death, he strips the temple and the palaces of all the valuables, so that Rehoboam now has to make shields out of bronze, because the shields out of gold, which would mostly be ceremonial, are gone, right? So there's this kind of immediate punishment for wrong.
Do you think because Solomon had so many wives that were associated with all that's why the people were still worshiping other gods?
Well, sure, and you get clearly in this, and you don't normally get this, but at both the beginning and the end of this description, it references the fact that Rehoboam's mom is an Ammonite, right? One of them. And this constant remembering back now, as you look back, this constant warning about don't intermarry with the people of the land, because the people of the land worship these other gods. And if you intermarry with the people of the land, your heart will be drawn away from the Lord and will be drawn away instead to these other gods. And of course, this is what's happening. Yeah, but it is interesting here because for the most part going forward, we will get reference to the king and what his actions were, good or bad. But here, at least it references the people. And now when he dies, Jeroboam is still in power up north. And so we've got to go ahead and catch up information about the son. And so just somebody take 15:1-8. And some of you will have Abijam, and some of you will have Abijah. So it's different ways of rendering the name.
In the 18th year of the reign of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Abijah became king of Judah, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 years. His mother's name was Maacah, daughter of Abishalom. He committed all the sins his father had done before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up a son to succeed him and by making Jerusalem strong. For David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and had not failed to keep any of the Lord's commands all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. There was war between Abijah and Jeroboam throughout Abijah's lifetime. As for the other events of Abijah's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? There was war between Abijah and Jeroboam, and Abijah rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. And Asa, his son, succeeded him as king.
Okay, so his father reigned 17 years. He reigns 3 years, so now we're up to 20. But Jeroboam reigned for 22, so we're still not done looking at the southern kingdom. And so that's what's going to come next. But here, notice that you're in this particular instance, you're not given any information about his mother except who she is, what her name is, and who her father in this instance was, but nothing referencing her nationality, right? From that sense. And we're told in verse 3, he committed all the sins that his father did. Well, they aren't listed. But so the writer of Kings very often will defer to those other books that we don't have. And say, you want more details, you got to look it up here. But so we're kind of asking, okay, so he's not giving us all the details. What are the details we're giving? And what's the point? And we'll be kind of following that as we work our way through. So we got another king, somebody verse 9 through 15.
In the 20th year of King Jeroboam of Israel, Asa began to reign over Judah. He reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, daughter of Abisalom. Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord, as his father David had done. He put away the male temple prostitutes out of the land and removed all the idols and that his ancestors had made. He also removed his mother Maacah from being queen mother because she had made an abominable image for Asherah. Asa cut down her image and burned it at the Wadi Kidron, but the high places were not taken away. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was true to the Lord all his days. He brought into the house of the Lord the votive gifts of his father and his own votive gifts, silver, gold, and utensils.
Okay, so maybe you notice it, maybe you don't, but there's a little confusion here because his father Abijah or Abijam had a mother named Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. And now you've got Asa, whose mother was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. So you're wondering, oh, what exactly was going on here, right? So some of the references aren't always clear. But Asa, 41 years. So that's going to get us well past Jeroboam. So we're going to hang out with him for a while. And verse 11 says,
Did things pleasing to the.
he did what was right. Just like David. And by the way, it was in that previous section where they said David was awesome, except for that, oh, so,
With discretion.
but, and what did he do? What are we told about what he did? Look very carefully, verse 12. He put away the male temple prostitutes, right? He removed the idols. He even got rid of his mother because she had made an idol. And he cut down that image. He burned it in the Wadi Kidron. The Wadi Kidron, or the Kidron Valley, is the trash dump. And so you're going to hear about everything being dumped in the Wadi Kidron. Similar to what, if you might recall what they did when they were in their wilderness time, they had places outside the camp. The camp was holy. And then outside the camp was where the unholy stuff. So the dump, the garbage, that kind of stuff can be put there, right? However, verse 14 says, he didn't get rid of the high places. But his heart was true. And he brought gifts into the house of the Lord. His own gifts.
Places were temples on the hills.
High places would just be shrines. Think of them as worshiping shrines of some kind. Not necessarily, right? They would, yeah, there could be altars there. But yeah, so the high places are, again, Liz, is yours say high place in verse 14, or does it say pagan?
Pagan shrine.
Pagan shrines. Okay, so at least they're being consistent in the way they render that translation. So there's these places to worship, be it legitimate worship of God or illegitimate worship of other gods. But here we go. So we're given a little information, and then really confusing. The next sentence, verse 16, there was war between Asa and King Baasha of Israel all their days. You going, who? Right? So Baasha is going to be the son of Jeroboam. We haven't gotten to him yet, but we'll get to him later when this little section's done. But it's a little bit confusing because you're introduced to a king that you don't even necessarily know anything about if you're just kind of reading your way through. And it says that King Baasha of Israel went up against Judah and built Ramah to prevent anyone from going out or coming in to King Asa of Judah. Then Asa took all the silver and gold that were left in the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house and gave them into the hands of his servants. King Asa sent then to King Ben-Hadad, son of Tabrimmon, son of Hezion of Aram, who resided in Damascus, saying, let there be an alliance between me and you, like that between my father and your father. I'm sending you a present of silver and gold. Go, break your alliance with King Baasha of Israel, so that he may withdraw from me. So there's a little triangulation going on here. And you know, again, this is a good king, but he just ripped off stuff from the temple to go make an alliance with a neighboring king, a neighboring pagan king, because you get the sense that it's not always as clean as it might be presented. So Ben-Hadad listened to King Asa, and he sent commanders of his armies against the cities of Israel. He conquered, and their list named. And when this happened, Baasha, in verse 21, when he heard this, he stopped building Ramah. This was kind of the fortress city, and he lived in Tirzah. Then King Asa made a proclamation to all Judah. None was exempt. They carried away the stones of Ramah and its timber, which King Baasha was been building, and with them he built Geba of Benjamin and Mizpah. Now the rest of the acts of Asa, all his power, all that he did, all the cities that he built, are they not written in the books of the annals, the kings of Judah? But in his old age, he was diseased in his feet. Then Asa slept with his ancestors and was buried with his ancestors in the city of his father David, and his son Jehoshaphat succeeded him. So we've kind of finished Asa off, and we're getting to his son, but now we got to back up because 41 years of reign, there's a bunch of turnover in the north, and we're going to spend some time looking at that. But notice how when Baasha's building up some fortress and areas, that he makes this pact with another king. They fight, they leave that, and then he sends his people all to go get all the supplies and bring them down and use them to build cities. So building materials were a limited resource. And throughout the narrative at times, you'll hear about these fighting that happens. And as soon as somebody pulls out of an area that they were fortifying, that is, as they were building them up, they're going to then, the people that drove them out are going to gather all those building supplies and take them down. So it's kind of like, if you don't like the this is not the lesson. That if you don't like the construction that's happening near you, that you hire someone to stop the construction, then you go steal all the tools and supplies. That's not the moral of the story, but that's what's happening here. Does that make some sense? All right, so now Jeroboam is dead. Somebody read just 25 and 26.
Nadab, son of Jeroboam, began to rule over Israel in the second year of King Asa's reign in Judah. He reigned in Israel 2 years, but he did what was evil in the Lord's sight and followed the example of his father, continuing the sins of that Jeroboam led Israel to commit.
Okay, so, and actually I misspoke earlier. So Nadab's the son of Jeroboam. Baasha is going to show up on the scene. Keep going.
Then Baasha, son of Agash, from the tribe of Issachar, plotted against Nadab and assassinated him while he and the Israelite army were laying siege to the Philistine town of Gibbethon. Baasha killed Nadab in the third year of King Asa's reign in Judah and became the next king of Judah. He immediately slaughtered all the descendants of King Jeroboam, so that not one of the royal family was left, just as the Lord had promised concerning Jeroboam by the prophet Ahijah from Shiloh. This was done because Jeroboam had provoked the anger of the Lord and the God of Israel by the sins that he had committed and the sins he had led Israel to commit. The rest of the events of the Nadab reign and everything he did was recorded in the book in the history of the king of Israel. There was constant war between King Asa and of Judah and King Baasha of Israel. Baasha, son of Ahijah, began to rule over all Israel in the third year of King Asa's reign in Judah. Baasha reigned in Tirzah 24 years, but he did what was evil in the Lord's sight and followed the example of Jeroboam, continuing the sins of Jeroboam had led Israel to commit.
Okay, so that little phrase of the sin of Jeroboam that he caused Israel to commit, or however it's worded, will get repeated over and over and over. In other words, neither Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, nor Baasha, the guy who, had a coup is what we'd call it, had a coup and overthrew him and wiped his whole family out, they continued to encourage the people to worship at Bethel and Dan. That's the sin of Jeroboam. So again, it's kind of confusing how it all pieces together. So now we've got a new dynasty happening in the north. It's no longer the Jeroboam family. They've been obliterated from the scene. Let's read. Keep going. 16, 1 through 7.
This message from the Lord was delivered to King Baasha by the prophet Jehu, son of H. He lifted you out of the dust to make you the ruler of my people Israel, but you have followed the evil example of Jeroboam. You have provoked my anger by causing my people Israel to sin. So now I will destroy you and your family, just as I destroyed the descendants of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. The members of the Baasha family who die in the city will be eaten by dogs, and those who die in the field will be eaten by vultures. The rest of the events in Baasha's reign and the extent of his power are recorded in the book in the history of the kings of Israel. When Baasha had died, he was buried in Tirzah. Then his son Elah became the next king. The message from the Lord against Baasha and his family came through the prophet Jehu, son of Hanan, and was delivered because Baasha had done what was evil in the Lord's sight, just as the family of Jeroboam had done, and also because Baasha had destroyed the family of Jeroboam. The Lord's anger was provoked by Baasha's sin.
Okay, so how long did he rule? It says he ruled 24 years. What are we told about? Hardly anything. Because he continued what Jeroboam started, worshiping in these other places. And so now he's going to get his family line is going to come to an end. So since we're having fun reading about all these family lines coming to an end, do you want to pick up verses 8 through 14?
Elah, son of Baasha, began to rule over Israel from Tirzah in the 26th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. He reigned in Israel 2 years. Then Zimri, who commanded half the royal chariots, made plans to kill him. One day in Tirzah, Elah was getting drunk at the home of Arza, the supervisor of the palace. Zimri walked in and struck him down and killed him. This happened in the 27th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. Then Zimri became the next king. Zimri immediately killed the entire royal family of Baasha. He did not leave a single male child. He even destroyed distant relatives and friends. So Zimri destroyed the dynasty in Baasha as the Lord had promised through the prophet Jehu. This happened because the sins of Baasha and his son Elah, and because of the sins that led Israel to commit, arousing the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, with their idols. The rest of the events of Elah's reign and all of his deeds are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel.
All right, so not much told there. And in fact, Zimri is going to now come in and have a coup. He's going to assassinate the king. He's going to take over, as you got a chance if you read it, not for very long. Keep going. 15 through 20.
Zimri began to rule over Israel from Tirzah in the 27th year of King Asa's reign in Judah, but he reigned only 7 days. When the army of Israel, which was then engaged in attacking the Philistine town of Gibbethon, heard that Zimri had assassinated the king, they chose Omri, commander of the army, as their new king. So Omri led the army of Israel away from Gibbethon to attack Tirzah, Israel's capital. When Zimri saw that the city had been taken, he went into the citadel of the king's house and burned it down over himself and died in the flames. For he too had done what was evil in the Lord's sight and followed the example of Jeroboam, continuing the sins of idolatry that Jeroboam had led Israel to commit. The rest of the events of Zimri's reign and his conspiracy are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel.
Okay, so he's king for 7 days. And he's condemned in the very same language as these other kings are, right? You sometimes get the sense that the writer is looking for one and only thing, and if that's not shown, bad king, bad king. So there's dynasty number 3. And now we get to the really bad dynasty. Go ahead, read through verse 23.
21 to 23.
Yeah,
But now the people of Israel were divided into 2 groups. Half of the people tried to make Tibni, son of Gintha, their king, while the other half supported Omri. But Omri's supporters defeated the supporters of Tibni, son of Gintha. So Tibni was killed and Omri became the next king.
okay, so we got what's going on here. Right? So we got a little mini civil war, but Omri is going to be the one who wins. And he's going to reign for 12 years, it says in verse 23. And half of them are in Tirzah, right? What's the rest of it? Keep going, 24 to 28. You're going to hear a city that you recognize.
Then Omri brought the hill, now is Samaria, from its owner, Shamir, for 150 pounds of silver. He built a city on it and called the city Samaria in honor of Shamir. But Omri did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. Impressive. He followed the example of Jeroboam, continuing the sins of idolatry that Jeroboam had led Israel to commit. Thus he aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel. The rest of the events of Omri's reign, the extent of his power, and all of his deeds are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Israel. When Omri died, he was buried in Samaria. Then his son Ahab became the next king.
So now Samaria shows up. And remember, in Hebrew, there's some letters like P and PH that are the same letter, and S and SH. So, if you will, Shamaria brought from Shemer. That's the connection here. And now we get the name of a king you might recognize. Keep going, finish the chapter. Dun, 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 dun.
Ahab, son of Omri, began to rule over Israel in the 38th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. He reigned in Samaria 22 years, but Ahab did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. And although it were not enough to live like Jeroboam, he married Jezebel, the daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians.
Sidonians.
There we go, thank you. He began to worship Baal. First, he built a temple and an altar for Baal in Samaria. Then he set up an Asher pole. He did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than any of the other kings of Israel before him. It was during his reign that Hiel, a man from Bethel, rebuilt Jericho. When he laid the foundations, his oldest son, Abriam, died. And when he finally completed it by setting up the gates, his youngest son, Segub, died. This all happened according to the message from the Lord concerning Jericho, spoken by Joshua, son of Nun.
So now we refer all the way back to Joshua's day, where after they destroyed Jericho, Joshua cursed and said, anybody who rebuilds this city will do it at the cost of his firstborn son and his youngest son. And how bad is Ahab? Ahab is so bad that that curse from hundreds of years ago is under his reign now going to come to be. All right. And here's where then we encounter Elijah. And the rest of First Kings is much going to be involved in Elijah. And so you have Elijah, he's a Tishbite because he grew up in Tishbe, right? Just like you are Fond du Lacians if you grew up, or whatever you might be, or a Fond du Lacites or something like that. But he says to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain for 3 years, except by my word. Okay. And so what happens then? Again, down here we get into some Sunday school stories, right? Because he'll go down by this brook, in this wadi, in this little dry gulch that only has water in it during the rainy season, and he's gonna get a little bit of water, and the ravens are gonna supply him some food, right? And then when that finally dries up, he's commanded to go to a place called Zarephath up in Sidon. This is now outside of the territory of Israel. And he's going to go hang out with this widow who thinks she is going to die, but she's actually going to be sustained because Elijah is there. And if you got a chance to read that, he has this, he goes and the place where she's at, she's gathering sticks. He says, make me a little something to eat. And she says, don't you know there's no rain, there's no food. I'm out here gathering sticks because I got this little bit of stuff left. And I'm going to feed myself and my son. It's going to be our last meal, and then we're going to die. Right. And Elijah says, no, you're not going to die. God will keep things going. Right. And that's exactly what happens. But then in the course of time, the woman's son gets ill and dies. And now she accuses him of just having come to punish her for some reason. But Elijah raises him from the dead. Good so far? That's chapter 17. In chapter 18, Elijah's told to go and present himself to Ahab. And this is kind of an interesting story. Somebody read 18, 1 through 19.
After many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year of the drought, saying, go present yourself to Ahab. I will send rain on the earth. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. The famine was severe in Samaria. Ahab summoned Obadiah, who was in charge of the palace. Now Obadiah revered the Lord greatly. When Jezebel was killed off the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets, hid them 50 to a cave, and provided them with bread and water. Then Ahab said to Obadiah, go through the land to all the springs of water and to all the wadis. Perhaps we may find grass to keep the horses and mules alive and not lose some of the animals. So they divided the land between them to pass through it. Ahab went in one direction by himself, and Obadiah went in another direction by himself. As Obadiah was on his way, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him, fell on his face, and said, is it you, my lord Elijah? He answered him, it is I. Go tell your Lord that Elijah is here. And he said, how have I sinned that you would hand your servant over to Ahab to kill me? As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom to which my Lord has not sent to seek you. And when they would say he is not here, he would require an oath of the kingdom or nation that they had not found you. But now you say, go tell your Lord that Elijah is here. As soon as I have gone from you, the Spirit of the Lord will carry you. I know not where. So when I come and tell Ahab, and he cannot find you, he will kill me. Although I, your servant, have revered the Lord from my youth. Has it not been told by the Lord that I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord? How I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets, 50 to a cave, and provided them with bread and water. Yet now you say, go tell your Lord that Elijah is here. He will surely kill me. Elijah said, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, is it you, you troubler of Israel? He answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now, therefore, have all Israel assemble for me at Mount Carmel with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 100 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table.
Okay, so a few interesting little pieces in here. As you read this, again, this is kind of a little bit of reading between the lines, but Obadiah, who's pretty high up, if you will, in government with this government job, is a worshiper of the Lord, right? And Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, what was she doing once she got into power? She was gathering up the prophets of the Lord and killing them. These are not prophets of the Lord from Judah, the southern kingdom. These are prophets of the Lord in the northern kingdom. So you can't just say all the northerners were pagans, right? They're not. And in fact, he finds 100. I mean, that's a pretty big amount, right? He finds 100 and apparently found a couple of large caves and he hides them in there. So he's been trying to keep the word of the Lord going, right? As he comes up to Elijah, and Elijah says, "Hey, tell Ahab I'm here." The idea is that Ahab's been chasing after Elijah, and he's afraid that, as soon as I go to tell Ahab you're here, God's going to grab you someplace and take you, and then it's going to be my neck. And he said, no, it's not going to happen, right? And so now Elijah confronts Ahab, and there's going to be this incredible event that happens on Mount Carmel. It's 450 prophets of Baal, the 400 prophets of Asherah versus Elijah. Somebody pick up with verse 20, reading through, turn these little pages. Where does it end? To verse 40, so 20 through 40.
So Ahab summoned all the people of Israel and the prophets to Mount Carmel. Then Elijah stood in front of them and said, "How much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him." But the people were completely silent. When Elijah said to them, "I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Now bring 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose whichever one they wish and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God." And all the people agreed. When Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "You go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it and call on the name of your God, but do not set fire to the wood." So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called on the name of the Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. "You'll have to shout louder," he scoffed, "for surely he is a god. Perhaps he is daydreaming or is relieving himself. Or maybe he is away on a trip or is asleep and needs to be wakened." So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice, but still there was no sound, no reply, no response. When Elijah called to the people, "Come over here," they all crowded around him as he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been taken down. He took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel, and he used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold about 3 gallons. He piled wood on the altar and cut the bull into pieces and laid the pieces on the wood. Then he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour the water over the offering and the wood." After they had done this, he said, "Do the same thing again. And when you are finished," he said, "now do it a 3rd time." So they did as he said, and the water ran around the altar and even filling the trench. At the usual time for offering the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God and that you have brought them back to yourself." Immediately the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell down on the ground and cried out, "The Lord, yes, he is God. Yes, the Lord is God." Then Elijah commanded, "Seize all the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one escape." So the people seized them all, and Elijah took them down to the Kishon Valley and killed them there.
All right. So you're probably familiar with this rather well-known tale. Interesting. This altar is okay, even though it's not in Jerusalem. Right. So you get the sense that, again, it's perhaps not as cut and dried as you might like, but this incredible confrontation, right? And even the kind of the teasing, right? Maybe your God's asleep, maybe he's in the bathroom, maybe, with the fan on and he can't hear what you're saying or something. So this is it. And now they're going to be the drought is going to end. And what happens then is Jezebel hears about this and she threatens Elijah's life, right? It's in chapter 19, verse 2. So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. And he flees for his life out into the wilderness, right? And somewhat akin to the narrative we had when oh, for goodness sakes, the mind's going blank. The Egyptian, Hagar. When Hagar was driven away from Abraham and Sarah with the boy, Ishmael, thank you. We're starting to go on screen. Whoop, you're watching the brain cells deteriorate, right? So she goes out and she's ready to die. We're going to have something similar because Elijah will go into the wilderness, right? And we'll have somebody read this. Chapter 19, verses 4 through 10 to start with.
But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone I am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away."
All right. So psychologically, we go from a incredible high to a real low, right? I mean, he's terrified at this point of Jezebel's threat to him. And he thinks what? He's the only one left. By the way, how long did he travel? 40 days, 40 nights. And where does he go? To Horeb, which we also know as Sinai, right? So you're going to have here Moses meeting God at Mount Sinai, Elijah meeting God at Mount Sinai, and those will play off later in some New Testament things. So keep going, Polly.
He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down the altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. Then the Lord said to him, Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael a king over Aram. Also, you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat of Abel Menhoa, as a prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him.
Okay, so is Elijah the only one left?
No.
No, there's 7,000, right? So again, it's not as if everybody up north is sinning in this sense, right? But that idolatry has certainly spread itself out. And of course, this is just a very dramatic, often well-known story, right? God's not in the earthquake, not in the wind, not in the fire, but in that stillness, that silence, right? And he's going to be now sent to do some continuing work. And we're going to be drawing kind of to the close of his ministry, although it takes a little longer than you might think. And so what happens at the end of that chapter 19, he goes and he finds Elisha and he throws his mantle over him, and Elisha will now become his servant, his follower, and eventually, of course, his successor. And sometimes people get Elijah and Elisha kind of confused, and that's understanding, right? In chapter 20, we're hearing about the war that Ahab, right? We're still dealing with Ahab at this point. And Ben-Hadad, he's got his army and all the kings that are fighting with him. And he says to Ahab, verse 3, your silver and gold are mine. Your fairest wives and children are mine. And this is sort of the, if you will, the terms of peace, right? Give me all your money and give me all your beautiful wives and your kids with high potential. And so he does that. And then he says, I'm going to send my servants to go check to make sure that you did that. And that apparently is too much of an offense, because Ahab says, and notice lots of times in the text, he's not called Ahab, he's just called the king of Israel, right? That the writer so despises him that he sometimes won't name him at all. Then the king of Israel called the elders of the land and said, look now, see, this man is seeking trouble. For he said, he got my wives, my children, my silver and gold. I didn't refuse him. And then they say, well, don't listen to him, right? And he sends back, he says, no, I can't do that. I can do the first part. I can't do the second. Well, now he's going to come and let him have it. And you get a little, I don't know, 10th century BC street talk, right? Tell him, verse 11, one who puts on armor should not brag like he who takes it off. Wouldn't that make you feel frightened and terrified, right? You're putting on armor when you're going to war. You're taking off your armor when you have successfully defeated your enemies. So don't talk big stuff until you can prove it and they're ready to fight. And now this prophet comes and he is nameless. Somebody read 13 through 22. Chapter 20.
Prophet
Yep.
came up to King Ahab of Israel and said, thus said the Lord, have you seen all this great multitude? Look, I will give it into your hand today, and you shall know that I am the Lord. Ahab said, by whom? He said, thus says the Lord, by the young men who serve the district governors. Then he said, who shall begin the battle? He answered, you. Then he mustered the young men who served the district governors, 232. After them, he mustered all the people of Israel, 7,000. They went out at noon. Well, Ben-Hadad was drinking himself drunk in the booths. He and the 32 kings allied with him. The young men who served the district governors went out first. Ben-Hadad had sent out scouts, and they reported to him, men have come out from Samaria. He said, if they have come out for peace, take them alive. If they have come out for war, take them alive. But these had already come out of the city, the young men who served the district governors and the army that followed them. Each killed his man. The Arameans fled, and Israel pursued them. But King Benadad of Aram escaped on a horse with the cavalry. The king of Israel went out, attacked the horses and chariots, and defeated the Arameans with a great slaughter. Then the prophet approached the king of Israel and said to him, come, strengthen yourself and consider well what you have to do. For in the spring, the king of Aram will come up against you.
And that's indeed what's gonna happen. So they had this first little skirmish, right? And the Aramean king was so confident that he was gonna defeat him that he just drank himself drunk, and it turns out it didn't work out. And so now we'll pick back up on the story a little bit further and jump to verse 26 and keep going.
In the spring, Benhadad mustered the Armenians and went.
No, not the Armenians, the Arameans.
And went up to Aphek to fight against Israel. After the Israelites had been mustered and provisioned, they went out to engage them. The people of Israel encamped opposite them like two little flocks of goats, while the Arameans filled the country. A man of God approached and said to the king of Israel, thus says the Lord, because the Arameans have said, the Lord is a God of the hills, but he is not a God of the valleys. Therefore, I will give all this great multitude into your hand, and you shall know that I am the Lord. They encamped opposite one another 7 days. Then on the 7th day, the battle began. The Israelites killed 100,000 Aramean foot soldiers in 1 day. The rest fled into the city of Aphek, and the wall fell on the 27,000 that were left. Benhadad also fled and entered the city to hide. His servants said to him, look, we have heard that the kings of the house of Israel are merciful kings. Let us put sackcloth around our waists and ropes on our heads and go out to the king of Israel. Perhaps he will spare your life. So they tied sackcloth around their waists, put ropes on their heads, went to the king of Israel and said, your servant Benhadad says, please let me live. And he said, is he still alive? He is, my brother. Now the men were watching for an omen. They quickly took it up from him and said, yes, Benhadad is your brother. Then he said, go and bring him. So Benhadad came out to him, and he had him come up into the chariot. Benhadad said to him, I will restore the towns that my father took from your father, and you may establish bazaars for yourself in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria. The king of Israel responded, I will let you go on those terms. So he made a treaty with him and let him go.
All right, so they thought, okay, you guys beat us in the hill country, but when we're down in the plains, we're going to take you out. Didn't prove to be the case at all. In fact, they were routed both through in war, and the fact that this wall fell down and killed a whole chunk of them. Then they presume upon the mercy of the king of Israel, and the king has mercy. Sounds so far so good. But at the end of chapter 20, a certain prophet of the Lord of the company of the prophets said to another, strike me. But he refused. Then he said, because you have not obeyed the voice of the Lord, as soon as you've left me, a lion will kill you. And when he left him, a lion met him and killed him. So just because you work for the Lord doesn't mean it's necessarily a good job, right? Right. Then he found another man. He said, strike me. So the man hit him, striking him, wounding him. Then that prophet departed, waited for the king alongside the road, disguising himself with a bandage over his eyes. We don't know exactly what that means, except that perhaps there was some sort of distinctive clothing that the prophets of the Lord would wear, or something that you would, when you see them, even from a distance, you'd say, that's a prophet of the Lord, but he's hiding that, right? As the king passes by, he cries, he says, and here's another one of these kind of Nathan stories, right? He says, your servant went out into the thick of the battle. A soldier turned to me, brought a man to me and said, guard this man. If he's missing, your life shall be given for his life, or else you'll pay a talent of silver. Well, I'm busy here and there. He was gone. The king of Israel said, your judgment shall be. You have said it yourself. You've decided it. Then he quickly took the bandage away from his eyes. The king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. Then he said to him, thus says the Lord, because you have let the man go, whom I have devoted to destruction, therefore your life shall be for his life, your people for his people. Right? So what Ahab thought he was being merciful when God had delivered his enemies into his hands, he didn't follow through. And now there's a price to pay. And this chapter ends with the words, the king of Israel set out toward home, resentful and sullen, and came to Samaria. Chapter 21 gives you a little insight into Jezebel. In fact, that name, she was already referenced several chapters back as being part of the reason Ahab was the worst possible king they could have ever had, because he married Jezebel. And still today, I've never met a Jezebel. Any of you ever met a Jezebel? It's just kind of one of those names that just sort of evokes bad news, right? It's kind of like Benedict Arnold or something, right? So what happens is there's Naboth, who has a vineyard, and Ahab wants it because he wants to have a vegetable garden. And Naboth says, no, this is my inheritance. I'm not going to give it to you. And Ahab kind of sulks, and his wife says, hey, you're the king of Israel. We'll get this figured out, right? So she hires a couple of worthless fellows to claim that Naboth has cursed God, and they bring, if you will, false witnesses against him, who testify as such, and so now he is put to death, and so Jezebel's plan worked, and she says, you get to have your vineyard, right? Well, Elijah finds out about this and threatens him, right? Let's pick it up. Verse 17 of chapter 21.
But the Lord said to Elijah, go down to meet King Ahab of Israel, who rules in Samaria. He will be at Naboth's vineyard in Jezreel, claiming it for himself. Give him this message. This is what the Lord says. Wasn't it enough that you killed Naboth? Must you rob him too? Because you have done this, dogs will lick your blood at the very place where they licked the blood of Naboth. So my enemy, you have found me, Ahab claimed to Elijah. Yes, Elijah answered, I have come because you have sold yourself to what is evil in the Lord's sight. So now the Lord says, I will bring disaster on you and consume you. I will destroy every one of your male descendants, slave and free alike, anywhere in Israel. I am going to destroy your family as I did the family of Jeroboam and son of Nebat, and the family of Baasha, son of Ahijah. For you have made me very angry and have led Israel into sin. And regarding Jezebel, the Lord says, dogs will eat Jezebel's body at the plot of land in Jezreel. The members of Ahab's family who died in the city will be eaten by dogs, and those who die in the field will be eaten by vultures. No one else completely sold himself to what was evil in the Lord's sight as Ahab did under the influence of his wife Jezebel. His worst outrage was worshiping idols, just as the Amorites had done, the people whom the Lord had driven out from the land ahead of the Israelites. But when Ahab heard this message, he tore his clothing, dressed in burlap, and fasted. He even slept in burlap and went about in deep mourning. Then another message from the Lord came to Elijah. Do you see how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has done this, I will not do what I promised during his lifetime. It will happen to his sons. I will destroy his dynasty.
All right, isn't that nice, huh? If you repent, it might go flop to your kids. But you get this picture of Ahab, right? It's just not pictured well. Well, chapter 22, we'll talk about this battle that will occur where the king of Israel aligns and joins forces with the king of Judah, and they're going to go fight. And Micaiah, a prophet, warns that this is a bad thing. And it is interesting. We don't have time to get through all of this, but it's a rather bold statement, right? Where Micaiah is speaking against the 400 prophets. And he has a contrary word. Then the 400 prophets, by the way, are saying, right, verse, what is that? Verse 6, go up, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king, right? So again, you get this sense that there are prophets, some of them true, some of them false, that the king is consulting them at times. He doesn't like Micaiah because whenever he gets his advice, it's always negative, right? And so you want to surround yourself with yes men, after all, right? Isn't that a great position to have when you're a leader? You surround yourself with people who agree with everything you say and tell you how wonderful you are. Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster, isn't it? And it's a recipe that doesn't just happen in ancient times, shall we say. But they're going to go and be destroyed, and that's exactly what's going to happen. So somebody read starting in verse 29 of chapter 22.
So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went up to Ramoth Gilead. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I will enter the battle in disguise, but you wear your royal robes. So the king of Israel disguised himself and went into battle. Now the king of Aram had ordered his 32 chariot commanders, do not fight with anyone, small or great, except the king of Israel. When the chariot commanders saw Jehoshaphat, they thought, surely this is the king of Israel. So they turned to attack him. But when Jehoshaphat cried out, the chariot commanders saw that he was not the king of Israel and stopped pursuing him. But someone drew his bow at random and hit the king of Israel between the sections of his armor. The king told his chariot driver, wheel around and get me out of this fighting. I have been wounded. All day long the battle raged, and the king was propped up in his chariot facing the Arameans. The blood from his wound ran into the floor of the chariot, and he died that evening. As the sun was setting, a cry spread through the army, every man to his town, every man to his land. So the king died and was brought to Samaria, and they buried him there. They washed his chariot at a pool in Samaria, where the prostitutes bathed, and the dogs licked up his blood, as the word of the Lord had declared. As for the other events of Ahab's reign, including all he did, the palace he built and adorned with ivory, and the cities he fortified, they are not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel. Ahab rested with his ancestors, but Ahaziah, his son, succeeded him as king.
And by the way, then this would have been Ben-Hadad, the king he had in control, and let him go. So you get the sense of this not panning out so well. And then we hear about Jehoshaphat. So now we finally get to swing back to the southern king. And we have, I'll read Jehoshaphat, this is verse 41, son of Asa, began to reign over Judah in the 4th year of King Ahab of Israel. He was 35 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 25 years. His mother's name was Azubah. And he walked in all the ways of his father Asa. He did not turn from it, doing what was right in the sight of the Lord. Yet the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and offered incense on the high places. Jehoshaphat also made peace with the king of Israel, who is Ahab, right? Won't be named unless he has to be. But now the rest of the acts of Jehoshaphat and his power that he showed, how he waged war, they're not written in the books of the annals of the kings of Judah. The remnant of the male temple prostitutes who were still in the land in the days of his father Asa, he exterminated. Okay, so, I forgot to tell you about that. There was no king in Edom, a deputy of the king. Jehoshaphat, let's see, deputy was king. Jehoshaphat made ships of Tarshish type to go to Ophir for gold, but they did not go, for the ships were wrecked at Ezion-Geber. Why? Because he made arrangements with a non-Israelite or a descendant of Abraham, right? Then Ahaziah, son of Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, let my servants go with your servants in the ships. But Jehoshaphat was not willing. So at least he was breaking off some of these alliances. And he slept with his ancestors, buried in the city of his father David. His son Jehoram succeeded him. And now Ahaziah, who's the son of Ahab, began to reign. He reigned during the 17th year, reigned 2 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, walked in the way of his mother and father, in the way of Jeroboam, and in the way of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. See the and in there? Who caused Israel to sin. He served Baal, worshipped him. He provoked the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger, just as his father had done. And that's where the first scroll ends. Well, we don't have time to read the second scroll, but we're going to look at a few pieces of it, right? So you're going to get Elijah, who continues to speak out against the northern kings, and he's going to die. Elijah's going to ascend to heaven in chapter 2. Elisha is going to take over for him, and he's going to do some incredible miracles and some interesting, questionable ones, like at the end of chapter 2, where he's poked fun at by a bunch of little boys who say, "Go away, bald head, go away, bald head." And he turns around, sees them, he curses them in the name of the Lord, and 2 she-bears come out of the woods and mauled 42 of them. You're going, some of these, right? I mean, but what as your chapter points out, perhaps, right? We don't know for sure, but perhaps this story is simply there to indicate that he has the power to bless and he has the power to curse. Right? Then there's ongoing war that takes place in chapter 3. Elisha and the widow's oil, similar to Elijah and the widow's meal, right? Then there's the Shunammite woman and the son. There's the Naaman. This is in chapter 5. And by the way, Naaman is a general of the king of Syria. Aram is Syria. And he has leprosy and he will be cleansed. Later on, when we get to the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 4, where Jesus preaches his hometown sermon, he references 2 of these things. He says, if you're going to tell me that you want me to do all the miracles here that you've heard me do, but let me remind you of a couple of things from the scriptures. When there was a terrible famine, Elijah the prophet was sent to only one person to help him out. She was a foreign woman in Zarephath of Sidon. And Elisha, during his time, there were all kinds of lepers, but we read only of one leper being cured, and that was Naaman, the Syrian. And as a result of that, the people in Nazareth are so angry with Jesus that they want to throw him off the hillside that the city is built on, right? So this mercy to foreigners is in the midst of some of these narratives, and this strong sense that we want God to only be for us and not for anyone else. We'll get some of that in there, but there's just a number of accounts in here of that. I want to take you to ahead. Let's see here. Jehu's anointed as the next dynasty in the north, and he's going to kill both the king of Israel and the king of Judah. Jezebel's finally going to die. This is in chapter 9. Ahab's descendants are going to be wiped out, and Jehu actually is going to not only wipe out them, he's going to wipe out all the worshipers of Baal. Right? And so you think, okay, maybe finally in the northern kingdom, we've got a king who's going to be faithful to God. And as you're reading between the lines, perhaps he was. But if you turn to chapter 10, verse 28, it says, "Thus Jehu wiped out Baal from Israel. But Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he caused Israel to commit, the golden calves that were in Bethel and in Dan," right? I mean, the writer hates those things. The Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in carrying out what I consider right, and in accordance with all that was in my heart, have dealt with the house of Ahab, your sons of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. So it sounds like a blessing, right? But Jehu was not careful to follow the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam, which he caused Israel to commit. Well, a daughter of Ahab and Jezebel is named Athaliah. And she was married to one of the kings of Judah. And her son became king after her husband died. And when her son was killed by Jehu, she made a grab for the throne. And she killed, or attempted to, all of her grandchildren in an attempt to solidify her control on the throne. This is in chapter 11. But it so happened that the youngest one was grabbed by an older sister who was married to a priest, and she hid him in the temple and kept him safe. And eventually he's named king. And when that happens, they're able to get Athaliah out of the picture. And Joash or Jehoash, and that's the other thing that's confusing. You have, could be Joash or it could be Jehoash. You get some of these names in here, but we need to cover a couple of other little pieces. Elisha dies, that's in chapter 13. In chapter 14, Amaziah reigns. A second Jeroboam, not related to the first one, takes control. Then there's a bunch of sort of dynastic chaos. And you start having a bunch of the kings killed off. We're going to move. I'm sorry, I got to move you fast to get done. Let's go to chapter 17. And we'll read this chapter to close and then go through some of our pictures. So who'd like to read 1 through 4 to start with, just to set the stage?
In the 12th year of King Ahaz of Judah, Uzziah, son of Elah, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, yet not like the kings of Israel who were before him. King Shalmaneser of Assyria came up against him. Uzziah became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found treachery in Uzziah, for he had sent messengers to King So of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria confined him and imprisoned him. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Syria. For 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria. He placed them in Hala on the Habor, the river of Gozan, in the cities of Medes.
Okay, so this is a very short description of the destruction of the northern kingdom. Keep going.
This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They had worshipped other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs of the kings of Israel had introduced. The people of Israel secretly did things secretly did things that were not right against the Lord their God. They built for themselves high places at all their towns, from watchtowers to fortified cities. They set up for themselves pillars and sacred poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them. They did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. They served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do this." Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, in accordance with all the law that I commanded your ancestors and that I sent to you by my servants, the prophets." They would not listen, but were stubborn, as their ancestors had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenants that he had made with their ancestors and the warnings that he had given them. They went after false idols and became false. They followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do as they did. They rejected all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves cast images of 2 calves. They made a sacred pole, worshipped all the hosts of heaven, and served Baal. They made their sons and their daughters pass through fire. They used divination and augury, and they sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God by walking in the customs that Israel had introduced. The Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel. He punished them and gave them into the land of plunderers until he had banished them from his presence. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam son of Nebat. Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord and made them commit great sin. The people of Israel continued in all the sins that Jeroboam committed. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel out of the sight, as he had foretold through his servants, the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their land to Assyria until this day.
Okay, there you go, until this day. So you get the sense this is written after the fact. So a very long explanation of why this destruction fell upon the northern kingdom, right? And you get the sense that God was patient and kept sending warnings to them. And we'll see more of this in subsequent lessons, because unfortunately Judah is not going to learn. And then, very interesting, the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cuthath, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria in place of the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and settled in its cities. So an ancient way of conquering is, as you defeat people, you uproot them from their land, move them to other places, and in the meanwhile, you move people back around from other places into the place you just overcame. It says, when they first settled there, they did not worship the Lord. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, the nations that you have carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land. Therefore, he has sent lions among them, and they're killing them, because they do not know the law of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, send there one of the priests whom you have carried away from there. Let him go and live there and teach them the law of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel. He taught them how they should worship the Lord. So there had to be people in the northern kingdom who were worshiping the Lord, right? But it continues. But every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the shrines of the high places that the people of Samaria had made. Every nation in the cities in which they lived. The people of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth. The people of Cuth made Nergal. The people of Ham, and it just kind of keeps listing them, right? It says they also worship the Lord and appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests of the high places, who sacrifice for them in the shrines of the high places. So they worship the Lord, but they also serve their own gods. after the manner of the nations from among whom they had been carried away. To this day, they continue to practice their former customs. They do not worship the Lord. They do not follow the statutes and the ordinances or the law or the commandment that the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. The Lord had made a covenant with them and commanded them, you shall not worship other gods or bow yourselves down to serve them or sacrifice to them, but you shall worship the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt with great power and with an outstretched arm. You shall bow yourselves to him, and to him you shall sacrifice. The statutes and the ordinances and the laws of the commandment that he wrote for you, you shall always be careful to observe. You shall not worship other gods. You shall not forget the covenant that I made with you. You shall not worship other gods, but you shall worship the Lord your God. He will deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies. They would not listen, however, but they continued to practice their former customs. So these nations worship the Lord, but also serve their carved images. To this day, their children and their children's children continue to do as their ancestors did. By the way, those foreigners who were moved into that land and settled in Samaria were later on known as Samaritans. And you get a picture already that they worship God, but they also do these other things. And so when we get to New Testament times, you're going to run into some of that conflict. Well, let's return to our pictures for a few moments here. So we have this rather confusing looking chart, but it's also rather helpful when you learn how to distinguish it. So we'll look at again, these are our kings. I'll jump ahead here. So at the top, it started when they entered the promised land. If you count these little boxes here, there's 12 of them because it's 12 tribes, right? There's this tribal league. Then you have this united monarchy. Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, then David, then Solomon. And the check marks, by the way, are check marks next to the good kings who get commended, right? And then on the left, all yellow, you have the descendants of David, with the exception of Athaliah, who's in this little box. You know, she's bracketed here, and an arrow or a line goes back to Ahab because she's Ahab's daughter. But up north, you have these kings and the relative time when they came to rule. And then you see these daggers with a drop of blood because these kings are murdered by the kings in a coup who take over next and set up their dynasty. And for example, Jeroboam, it's Jeroboam and his son. And then that's the end of that dynasty. Then Baasha and his son. That's the end of that dynasty. Zimri, he doesn't really even get a thing. Remember, he kills himself after 7 days. Then you have Omri, Ahab, Azariah, and Jehoram. And this is also what's confusing. Notice at 849, you've got a Jehoram, son of Ahab and Jezebel. And over here, you've got a Jehoram also at 849, but it's a different Jehoram. So, and sometimes they're called Joram. So it's a little confusing. But then Jehu and his descendants for a while, they continue on down, but then at the end, you've got from 745 to 721. So that's a period of what? We'll be generous and say 25 years. It's not quite, but you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kings. Boom, 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 boom happening. And then in 721, and that's where we just read in 2 Kings 17, this is when the Assyrians come and they overrun the northern kingdom. And it falls and ends and is gone. And there is no, while those northern tribes don't get wiped out, they're dispersed and they never come back in any formative kind of way. But we do know that they persisted. For example, when we get to Luke and Jesus, the baby Jesus is presented in the temple. Anna is the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher, one of those northern tribes. So we know that there's some of these, connections that are still kind of happening there. Meanwhile, in the southern kingdom of Judah, we have some things going on. So during Ahaz's reign, we're going to spend some little bit of time with Hezekiah. We'll spend a whole chapter, a whole unit on Josiah coming up. But as you can see at the bottom, at the end, the southern kingdom doesn't learn the lesson, even when they saw what happened in the north. And they too will go into exile in Babylon. We'll pick up on some of that. But that's kind of where we're going. So we got this tribal league, we got the kings of Judah, we have the kings of Israel, and that's what this picture is about. And that's the picture for that unit. Might still be. It's not necessarily easy. But let's look at a couple other things in your textbook, and then we'll look quickly at a couple things in the question book. Okay. So page 79 tries to, again, spell out some of what is going on. It also, on page 80, lists what's happening in the wider international scene. Remember that Israel, whether it's united or not, is not a giant superpower like Egypt would be, like Assyria would become, or like Babylon would become. But during this period of time, there is a little bit of help to know what's happening in the more international scene, and so they spell that out. But point 3 in that section on page 80 gives you an idea of the fierceness of the Assyrians, right? So it doesn't, this kind of information doesn't remove the ugliness that we've read, but it certainly puts it into perspective. I mean, it was bad, but it wasn't, I mean, this is almost gross, right? In some ways. But the Assyrians were feared. So if I was wrong and Gene Roddenberry did not pattern the Klingons after the Philistines, he did it after the Assyrians, one way or the other. He used one of these Old Testament people in Star Trek to kind of figure out who the Klingons were. But what's happening is in page 81 and 82 is just trying to give you some of the major themes. So I hope you got a chance to read that. But look at point number 3 on page 81. It says the writer has a specific purpose in mind. Remember, telling us certain things, but not telling us others, saying, if you want to find out about this information, you got to go to these other books. So that kind of gives us an idea that he's attempting, I think he probably, anyway, attempting to tell you certain things for a certain reason, right? We'll get even more of that when we get to Unit 19. But it is interesting that this quote shows up a little later in 2 Kings. Before Josiah was king, there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him, right? There's your, if you will, your paragon of virtue. So when we get there, we're going to see, well, what in the world did Josiah do that made him such a superstar in the eyes of this writer? So that's just a little hint of what's coming. Okay. What else do I want to make sure you see? This gives you some information of Elijah and Elisha. Yeah, and then there's just kind of some summaries of the kings. Look at page 89 for just a minute. By the way, on page 89, do you show 976 or 876 for Omri? Yeah, it's 876. He didn't rule for 100 and some years. Okay. But he's the one who moved the capital to Samaria. But look at that interesting little phrase that he says in there. The Assyrians thought enough of Omri's dynasty that they referred to Israel as the land of Omri long after his family line ceased. So he is viewed very negatively in the biblical narrative, but he must have had some pretty impressive things that these foreign people referred to his land as the land of Omri. So let's turn in the question book briefly to that last little section on pages 37 and 38. Number 1 says, although the northern kingdom was destroyed in 721, and many of its citizens were taken into exile, the Israel left behind intermarried with those Assyrians brought in from the other parts. The empire, their offspring, these marriages became known as the Samaritans. We'll turn to Matthew chapter 4. Where does Jesus begin his ministry? What'd you find?
Well, it was very long.
Yeah, in Galilee, up north, which would be the northern kingdom, right? And so what would be significant in terms of that? Well, the leaders of Jesus' day said, if you're going to be anything, you need to be doing your work where? Jerusalem, right? And so you're going to see how that gets repeated over and over and over. And so much of Jesus's ministry is in Galilee. And he'll even describe himself as being sent to the lost tribes of Israel, coming to gather them. And his opponents, his strongest opponents and detractors, will be from Jerusalem. It sets up an interesting contrast. Well, did you see any of God's grace, as number 2 asks? We've seen a lot of nasty as we've read through these texts. Did you jot down anything with respect to God's grace?
You didn't wipe everybody out.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty amazing that, and again, we'll pick up a totally different perspective on this when we jump to the prophets. So if you don't see it yet, don't worry about it.
Well,
It'll-
how he sustained Elijah. I mean.
Yeah.
That's like a life-threatening suicidal depression. And okay, you don't have it in you to get food and water. Well, I'll place you by food and water, and I'll place birds to deliver you food and water. And then I'll give you an angel or to come
Something.
nudge you to take care of yourself in the very most basic of ways.
Mhm.
Like, that is pure grace.
That's good. That's good. How about the next part of that question? The fact that the biblical writers often concern themselves with learning from the events of history rather than merely cataloging them. Any sense of that?
Because they continually evaluate them by how they worship God.
Yeah. It's not just the facts, ma'am. It's what does this mean, huh? It's a kind of famous Lutheran question, right? Remember from your catechism days? What does this mean? They're trying to capture this sense of what God is doing, not only in history, but how that applies to our lives today. Even that, we skipped a lot in 2 Kings, but that chapter we read, you might want to reread that chapter because it goes on to explain over and over and over and over, repeating several times that God kept sending them prophets to warn them, and they didn't listen and they didn't turn, right? I love the question where it says, number 3, what patterns do you see between the elite in Israel and Judah and the behavior patterns of the ruling elite around the world?
We didn't get much wiser.
Yeah, we haven't learned much, huh? We're facing the ugly of humanity as we work our way through some of this narrative. And for me, again, it's part of the veracity is the fancy word, but it's what helps me find truth in the scripture, that it doesn't shy away from the ugly, right? It's not all whitewashed and painted. Everybody's not made to sound so pleasant and good. But
Well, something's more believable if it's not all polished and shiny, right?
Yeah.
We all know that's fake,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just like jewelry. If you see something that has a wonderful sparkle, it's probably not a real diamond, right? I mean, there's just a lot of truth to that. If you only see the shiny outside, it's probably not the real thing.
That's good. That's good. Well, let's turn to our prayers here, shall we? Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. Well, when we come back next time, we will be looking at the unfortunate end of the Southern Kingdom. The good news is we're going to be reading from 2 Kings, chapters 18 through 25, right? So we've only got eight chapters to cover, and yeah, and so we'll have a chance to spend a little more time in the text and a little more time with the picture. But then notice, if you're looking at your schedule, the next unit after that, we're going to actually back up and spend time in just chapters 22 and 23. So we'll work through those chapters a little bit in the next lesson, but then we'll actually come back and kind of concentrate on those, because we'll get a chance to look at Josiah. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll round out this section by looking at the concepts of worship and the concept of war, and that will complete this part 2. So we've got a few weeks left before we do part 3, which is all going to focus on prophets. So hang in there, and we will see you the next time. Remember that we